Hello and welcome to Political Thinking, a conversation with, rather than a newsy interrogation of, someone who shapes our political thinking about what has shaped theirs. My guest this week made the cover of Time magazine when they profiled the first Muslim leader of a Western democracy. He is, as the headline put it, the new face of Scotland, the youngest leader this country has had in quarter of a century of having a devolved Scottish government. But this amidst Humza Yousaf, who's talking to me here in the Scottish government headquarters in Glasgow, has actually been a difficult year for him. Difficult for his party too, dogged by a police investigation, criticised for failing to deliver, and divided about when independence might actually be possible. Humza Yousaf, First Minister, thanks for joining me on Political Thinking.
No, real pleasure.
It has been quite a year, hasn't it?
You're telling me. You're telling me.
How much do you feel you've aged in that time?
I think people could probably look at pictures before I became First Minister and pictures 10 months on and draw their own conclusions. But I suppose Hogmanay was a really interesting point. When Nadia and I were seeing in the new year, my wife Nadia and I were seeing in the new year, she said to me, could you imagine last year when we were at my parents' house? They live in the kind of south side of Glasgow, East Renfrewshire, not far from Glasgow. And my mum and dad had gone to bed at 11. They were like, we're too old for this, we're going to bed. Happy New Year, kids. And it was me, my wife, and my stepdaughter, Maya. And we had Jules Holland's Hootenanny on the television, did a little bit of a dance around the living room, much to the disgust of my stepdaughter. And by about 12:30, we were in bed. And, you know, we would never have envisaged Hogmanay, what 2023 would have in store for us personally, let alone for the country that we love. And it's been a whirlwind 10 months, I think.
Well, it would have been a whirlwind anyway, wouldn't it? Because of the politics. In a second, we'll talk about what your wife's family, what you have been through, given that she has family in Gaza now. Just looking back, though, at that year as First Minister, not quite a year, what are the best bits of the job? What are the worst bits of the job?
So the best bits are very much and easily the fact that every single day, without a shadow of a doubt, I get to make somebody's day. And it can be something really small. It can be a selfie, right? Or somebody saying, I didn't expect to see you here. Can I get a picture with a kid? It can be something quite transformational. It can be a policy that we're bringing forward. It can be something that has literally changed somebody's life. But every single day in this job as First Minister, you get to make somebody's day, if not many people's day.
That's the good thing. What's the bad?
That's the good thing. The bad thing is the press intrusion. There's no getting away from it. And your family, your children, being in the public eye. I mentioned my 14-year-old stepdaughter. She's in school. She's at that age where you can't really protect her from what's going on, what's in the newspapers, what's not. Whereas I can do that with my 4-year-old. A bit easier to do. But you can't really do it with your 14-year-old, and that kind of constantly being under the spotlight, I think, can be really difficult at a different level than even being a cabinet minister.
No, you were always going to be under the spotlight anyway. You're a politician. It's a difficult time for the SNP. You're First Minister, but then along comes Gaza, and your wife's family are stuck when the bombs start to fall. I don't think I can imagine how difficult, how traumatic that must have been.
I think traumatic is the right word. You know, we woke up on October the 7th and, you know, I saw from my wife's phone there was multiple messages from her mum who was in Gaza, and I said, kind of nudged my wife awake and said, Naz, I think you better check why there's 10, 15 messages. And I was worried because Nadia's gran, who's in Gaza, she's 93, still in Gaza. I thought maybe something had happened to her. And Nadia looked at the messages, and of course we began to panic, and there's no other word for it. Nadia's mother was explaining what had happened in terms of the dreadful, abhorrent terror attack in Israel. And of course, immediately their worry was the retaliation, what was going to be the reaction from Israel.
They had some sense of what might be coming.
Oh, undoubtedly. And Nadia's family actually, they travel to Gaza every single year in the summer before the blockade began. And she's been there when there's been gunfire or the odd airstrike here and there. But they knew by the fact that Israel had not only, Hamas had not only got into Israel but taken the number of hostages they had, that the retaliation would be severe. And that was immediately the thought of how do we get is there any way of getting Nadia's mum and dad, the wider family, of course, but certainly Nadia's mum and dad,
to get them out
of Gaza? And
yeah.
It became very apparent early on that the borders were sealed and shut.
The borders were sealed, and quite often the communications were cut, weren't they? So
Absolutely.
You must have had nights, your wife Nadia must have had nights where you had no idea, is this putting it too strongly, whether they'd be alive the next morning?
No, not putting it strongly at all. That is exactly what it was like. I think, look, I'll be frank, the 4 weeks that my mother-in-law and father-in-law were in Gaza are probably the lowest points of my life and of Nadia's life. They were really difficult 4 weeks, precisely because day by day, night by night, we did not know if they were going to live or not. And I can remember the time at SNP conference, in the midst of all of this, my first conference as party leader, trying to concentrate on what I have to deliver for the party and the members. But I get a call just first day into the conference, actually first night of conference, my mother-in-law at 1 a.m. saying that their neighbour has been told that they're about to get hit, to evacuate. So of course the whole neighbourhood, because of the impact of that strike that they're worried about, the whole neighbourhood is wandering the streets. Now it turned out that that was a false message, but I got a call at 1 a.m. of my mother-in-law crying and saying, I'll never forget what she said to me. She said to me, you take care of my girls. And for me that was really tough. And
She thought you thought that was the last call.
That was it. She was phoning me to say her goodbyes. 1 a.m. UK time. I think it was 3 a.m. in Gaza. She was phoning me to say, you just make sure you take care of my girls. And I thought, how do I respond to that? And thankfully, touch wood, they were fine. But we had moments like that, multiple phone calls in the middle of the night, thinking that that is the last time we're going to speak to them.
And still moments for some of the family, because the family faced a very painful choice, didn't they? Some could escape, others are still stuck.
When my father-in-law arrived back in Scotland, we met him at Edinburgh Airport. My father-in-law, he's a great man, but he is the alpha male of the alpha males. It's his way of being. And I've never heard him or seen him come close to shedding a tear. But he absolutely broke down when he was explaining to me the fact that he had to say goodbye to his son and his mother.
His son, now that's your wife's sister, who's a doctor, still
wife's
working.
brother, yeah, wife's brother who's there, who's a doctor, works in a hospital in Khan Yunis. And his mother, who's 93, and he just doesn't know to this day whether he'll see them again.
You said how difficult it was for you being at that SNP party conference. You're on show pretty much all the time there. Constant interviews, constant people talking to you. Was it difficult to do the job when that was happening? I mean, were there mornings, frankly, where you thought, I don't want to get out of bed, let alone go and face the cameras, have meetings?
Of course it was difficult, and that's where I'm so grateful to the team. And I've got a wonderful, amazing, talented cabinet and ministers. Many of them would step in and say, look, you don't need to do that evening event. I can go shake the hands, I can do the speech. You go back to Nadia and just make sure you're there for her, make sure you're there for the kids. But ultimately, look, Nadia was the same. We had to make sure there was never any question of not doing conferences, not doing the job. Nadia was like, we have to go and do the job. You are the people's first minister. You're there to do a job. You're there to make sure the country's running. And you've got to provide leadership as well. This is a really important moment for you to do that.
Well, it's interesting you talk about providing leadership because you did something striking. Striking, I think, for any leader, but striking for a Muslim leader of a country. You went to a synagogue very soon after the 7th of October. And it was a pretty powerful message, I think most people would agree. What was it you wanted to tell them, the Jewish community there?
I think very simply, to that community, who, by the way, I'd grown up with. I grew up in part of the country, Newton Mearns, that has the biggest Jewish population in the entire country. I grew up in the arms of the Jewish community, actually. Went to school in a school that has the largest Jewish population in it, in the country, or did at the time. My message was a really simple one, that their grief was my grief. I was feeling grief. And actually, when the rabbi came to greet me outside of the synagogue when I arrived, he and I embraced and we cried. We shed tears. Because he understood what I was going through, and I understood that he has children in Israel who are fearing for their lives.
Could you make that visit now? Yeah. Given what's happened in Gaza, given the divisions that have spread in communities and between communities, given, of course, the huge death toll in Gaza, would it be possible to have that sentiment now?
Absolutely. Do you know the meeting I had just before I came on this podcast? It was with the Jewish student representatives. So I just met here in this building a whole group of JSOCs, Jewish societies and universities right across Scotland. And the message is the same. Look, we must be able to, as a race, frankly, a human race, be able to show empathy to each other. This is not a competing narrative here. You can absolutely, as I do, express grief for Israeli families who have either lost a loved one because of those abhorrent terrorist attacks or indeed are suffering because their families have been taken hostage. And you can grieve for the human catastrophe of Gaza, which is undeniable. And
but the thing is, you have to make choices as a leader. And unlike Keir Starmer, say, the Labour leader, you have been much more critical of Israel than the Prime Minister or indeed the leader of the opposition in Westminster. And you've talked about Israel's military action being tantamount to ethnic cleansing. Very strong words.
That's not what I said. What I said was the statements from certain senior members of Netanyahu's government, so the National Security Minister, the Finance Minister, when they make statements that are saying that Gazans should be resettled and in Gaza there should be Israeli settlements, that is textbook ethnic cleansing. There's no ifs or buts about it. If you're saying one ethnically homogenous group should be removed from their land and another ethnically homogenous group should be there and settled there can't be really any argument about the fact that that is ethnic cleansing. And that's my worry, and that's my concern.
That's the real agenda.
Well, that you have some extreme elements in Netanyahu's government that want that to be the end game and the end goal, and we must resist that by saying that the land of Gaza belongs to the people of Gaza. And I've not heard much equivocation from world leaders on that point.
Is what we're seeing genocide?
Well, look, that'll be for the ICJ to determine. That'll be for courts to determine.
I ask you, as you probably know, because your wife, Nadia, says what we're seeing is textbook genocide in real time. Yeah, look,
Nadia's responsible for her comments. We've gone far, far past the time, I think, when husbands speak for wives and have to, explain what it is that their wives say. Nadia speaks for herself, and she speaks very powerfully and articulates herself very powerfully. She doesn't need me to explain.
She might say, others might say, well, why not call it that?
Well, I think what it's important for me to do as a leader is to respect international law and to say, by the way, the crime of any breach or potential breach of international law should be investigated all the way up to and including genocide. It's right, by the way, that the ICJ, I have no equivocations around this, that the ICJ should absolutely be investigating this matter, and they'll come to a judgment, no doubt, in due course.
So it might be genocide, but it's up for others to judge.
It's for the court to determine. Yeah.
Now, interestingly, the politics of the Middle East, as you alluded to, have in a sense followed you throughout your life. At school, you mentioned. 9/11 becomes a formative experience for you when you're at school.
Completely. It's the day that changed my life. And I know that sounds strange, being thousands of miles away from where the event took place, but 9/11 took place, I think, on a Tuesday. Watched the same news coverage, rolling news coverage on no doubt BBC that everybody else would have watched. And then I get to school on the Wednesday morning, and my two friends that I sit beside in registration class, as it was then, are asking me, bombarding me actually with questions that I have no idea the answer to. Why do Muslims hate America? Who did these attacks? Do you know? And it wasn't malicious. They just assumed, being Muslim, I must know the answer to it. And I remember that night, sitting down with my dad. Dad used to watch, and still does to this day, watch the 10 o'clock news. You're pleased to know the BBC News.
This is good.
10 o'clock news every single evening. And I sat there, and usually 9:59 I'd go, right, that's my cue, I'll go on the computer or maybe go upstairs or do whatever. And this time I sat down and my dad went, "You watching the news with me?" I said, "Yeah, I kind of want to know what's going on." He said, "All right." And that to me was an absolutely pivotal moment where I had to make a decision, I think, about, well, actually, do I just hide away, say it's got nothing to do with me, which obviously, of course, 9/11 didn't, but say that there's, as a community, do we just shy away? Or do we actually say, actually, our faith condemns in the strongest possible terms, the taking of any innocent lives, let alone the thousands that we saw that lost their lives in 9/11. And that was a real moment where I thought, I'm going to become politically active.
Why, though? I can understand entirely why seeing 9/11 might make you think, I have to confront these questions that I'm being asked at school. That doesn't explain to me why politics. I mean, your dad, who you mentioned already, your dad wasn't in politics. Your mum wasn't in politics.
Oh, but
what is it when we see this? When we see this guy's on the front cover of Time, he's the first Muslim leader of his country, the youngest cabinet minister ever, the youngest first minister ever. Why?
So they weren't in the front line of politics, but they were very political in the sense that. So my father was the first member of the SNP from an Asian background in Glasgow. He joined in the 1970s, but by the way, joining the SNP was almost seen as an act of betrayal. I mean, the Asian community, you know, we voted Labour. That's what we did in the 1970s. You know, when my dad joined the SNP, and he actually became a bit of a black sheep from the community for daring to even go against the kind of political tide that the immigrant community at that point was voting for Labour. And mum was Labour for a long, long time. And then Dad joined, as I say, the SNP in the 1970s. We'd have this kind of bizarre situation in my house where Mum's Labour poster would be in the downstairs window and Dad's SNP poster would be in the top. And I remember my mum being absolutely gutted in 1992. I was very, very young at the time. But I still remember just how upset she was that Neil Kinnock didn't become the Prime Minister. So we had a very political household. But Dad and Mum never forced us into politics. I suppose what happened post 9/11, so we had 9/11. There was then very quickly the invasion in Afghanistan. And I remember the Muslim community decided to call a meeting quite kind of in between that period, between 9/11 and the invasion beginning. And I was invited to it largely because I was known as being a bit kind of gobby, frankly. And, you know, the guy spoke a lot and, you know, sometimes he made sense. So let's invite, and I was by far the youngest person that was invited to this meeting. And genuinely there was discussion amongst the Muslim community that was present. And there was a big generational divide, I remember. There was the kind of older members of our Muslim community who were saying, lay low, put your heads down, this will all blow over. And there was a younger lot, myself included, saying, but this is an opportunity. Like, we shouldn't feel like we're not proud to be Muslim. We are Muslim. This is our faith. This is our country, born here, bred here, raised here. This didn't happen in my name. And we've now got a choice. And that's a choice I decided to take.
Is it true that your dad, who, as you say, became an SNP supporter quite early after he arrived in this country, made a link between the politics of his home country, Pakistan, with the politics of yours, Scotland? This notion of proud independent nations.
Yes, I mean, that was really interesting. Dad's an accountant, and that's relevant because in his school, he decided to take, well, the equivalent here would now be advanced higher maths, so took maths in 6 year. I think it was 6 year studies back then, he took maths. And it was only him and a Chinese student. So my dad and the Chinese student and a teacher. And his teacher, he says, was an English man who supported the SNP. And far from teaching my dad maths, he would often go on big rants about politics and say, why don't you guys join the SNP? You know, because, we're a proud party, we're a party that's multicultural and all the rest of it. And my dad said to me, in 6 year studies, and he'd only been in this country for a few years, my dad's assumption had been that Scotland was an independent country. He didn't realise that it was part of another country. And for him, he just completely was converted by this 6 year teacher. But he thought to himself, yeah, well, why should Scotland not make decisions for itself in the same way his country...
Yeah, the reason I ask it is because here in Scotland, the idea of being a nationalist, it's not a phrase that often people at the SNP like, but it's something of pride. It's pride in identity, pride in country. It's a belief in self-government, escaping from being ruled from down south. And yet, in most other parts of the world, nationalism is often seen in a very different way, as a kind of hostile to others, aggressive. Look, after all, at the region that your father came from. Nationalism in Pakistan, nationalism in India now, is very destructive, very dangerous, arguably.
Yeah, I think that's right. And and that's why I don't make the comparisons, by the way. I should be, be very clear about that. I don't make the comparisons between what happened in partition with what we're doing here in Scotland. That's a very obvious point to make, but worth reiterating. I mean, I've never really been comfortable with the fact that we have national in our party's name, not because I think the founding members of the SNP had any far right inclination. They certainly didn't, or any nationalist inclination in the way that you express it there. But because it can be misinterpreted. But we are the Scottish National Party. We have a very strong brand, very strong identity, but we've worked really hard to make it really clear, and I think this now is well understood, that we're a civic national party. We're a party that believes it doesn't matter really where you come from. What's important is where are we going together, and there's no doubt about our politics being very rooted in the left and the centre-left of political discourse.
Well, it's interesting you say the centre-left, because you've said in the past that, is hero too strong a word? Inspiration, maybe? Is Gordon Brown?
Oh, I don't think I've said either of those.
I think the word inspiration, I was told.
I think I was told admire a politician.
Yeah, we'll disagree on things, but I suspect we'd agree on much more. I wish we could work together, you once said.
Yes, look, my political approach always, from day one that I've entered politics, is try not to look at the party label of an individual and try to see whether or not I can get along with them, work with them and collaborate with them.
But beyond independence, can you think of anything you disagree with them on?
I don't know. I haven't examined Gordon Brown's policies in all that much detail.
Sure, but can you think of anything that you wouldn't fit perfectly comfortably within the Labour Party other than independence?
Well, I mean, the current Labour Party, there's a number of things that I would disagree with. For example, I don't think they are serious about tackling poverty, otherwise they would commit to lifting the 2-child limit.
These debates happen all the time about this or that policy.
And I don't think they're a party that genuinely...
centre-left.
I don't believe that they're a party that genuinely believes in, for example, progressive taxation in the way that I do at the moment. So I've got a fair number of disagreements. What I admire about Gordon Brown, and I admired about Alistair Darling, is, look, there's two people, Scottish, incredible experience. One is Prime Minister and Chancellor, and the other one, in Alistair Darling's case, is Chancellor. These are people that, I would absolutely value having a conversation with and saying, right, we may disagree on the Constitution, there's other things we'll disagree on, but where can we learn, and where can I learn from the experience that you've had in those important roles?
But you see, sometimes looking from the outside, I confess, I am looking from the outside in on Scottish politics, this looks like that scene in the life of Brian. This is the People's Popular Front of Judea versus the Popular People's Front of Judea. You basically agree about politics. Yeah, of course you'll have an argument about this tax rate or that benefit or this policy, but you're involved in some extraordinary Shakespearean internecine war. While the Romans, by the way, in the film The Tories in this case, are laughing because you're fighting.
Well, actually, what I would say is a couple of things. One, there is a lot more actually in our politics that unites us than divides us. The Constitution, though, is not a small matter. I'm sure we'll get into the detail of that. I mean, that is fundamentally an issue here in Scotland, and I'm sure we'll be getting on to talking about the general election. In Scotland, that's why a large part of my message to those who believe in independence, which is sitting around 50-50, depends on which poll you look at, but around the 50% mark. Look, Keir Starmer's going to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. There's no ifs or buts or maybes about it. He's going to be the Prime Minister. So if you believe in independence, vote for what you believe in. Vote for a party that is going to help you to deliver and advance that cause of independence.
To which, of course, they say, if you believe in Keir Starmer being Prime Minister, you better vote for him, because you can't take the result for granted. One thing you can say is the general election has nothing to do with independence. It's a choice of who occupies number 10.
No, look, what you can say is Keir Starmer doesn't need Scotland to win. He's 20 to 25 points ahead in the polls. If you can show me a single... If you can show me a single poll, or tell me of a single poll that does not show a sweeping victory for Keir Starmer, I haven't seen it yet. So please do.
I can tell you that Theresa May said something quite similar in 2017, but it didn't turn out that way. It
doesn't matter what she said. The polls, have of course been consistent. So he doesn't need Scotland to win. What Scotland does need, though, is that Westminster listens to our country, and the only way Westminster listens to Scotland, doesn't ignore Scotland, is when you have a large cohort of SNP MPs.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the hurdles you've got to overcome. In the introduction, I said you had a few. One you're going to tell me is not for you, it's for the police. But just briefly, on this police investigation, are people entitled to know the outcome of that before they go to the ballot box?
Look, that would be me interfering in the police investigation, because it would be me saying, look, the police have to conclude that investigation at a certain time scale. I can't do that. I've got to let the police do what they've got to do in the time that they've got to do. I suppose it's fair to say, and I'm not going to treat your listeners as fools, the police investigation has been one of the most difficult times for the party. There's no ifs or buts or maybes about it. And there has clearly been an impact in terms of how we're perceived by the public and issues of trust. And I've got to work hard, as I hope I have been doing over the last 10 months. I've got to work hard to make sure that people know, whatever the outcome of that police investigation is that the SNP is a party they can trust. But it's been difficult, no doubt, for those involved. There's certainly no doubt about that. But difficult for us as a party, and certainly been a challenge for me in my first 10 months.
Talking of those involved, do you still think Nicola Sturgeon is the most impressive politician in Europe?
Yes, I think if you look at what she's achieved politically, the successes she's had in multiple elections, what she's been able to do within government, then yes, I don't doubt that she's one of the most, if not the most impressive politician in Europe from a political perspective.
You wouldn't be human if you didn't occasionally look and think, what on earth did they do?
Again, that will be a matter for the investigation in terms of what has happened. I don't know, much more, of course, than what we hear and see in the press. Of course, I'll get regularly updated and informed from our party solicitor. But look, whatever happens in that police investigation, I've got a job to do to make sure that the SNP is a trusted party, and that's what I'll be doing from now until the general election and beyond.
Well, that brings us to problem two. If problem one's the police investigation, you were very clear, and you've been clear throughout the time you've been First Minister, it's all about delivery. You said, if we deliver, we're credible. If we're credible, people will carry on supporting us. When you look, though, at the record, this isn't the interview to go in detail through this or that policy, but when you look at the record on public services, on health, on education, which allowed the woman who ran against you to be leader to say, when you were transport ministers, the trains were never on time. When you were justice minister, the police were strained to breaking point. As health minister, we got record waiting times. Do you have to look the electorate in the eye and say, we haven't delivered well enough?
No, I think what we say to the electorate is, of 16 and a half years in government, here's what we've delivered, and be upfront about that. And I won't go through all of the detail, but talking about the fact that last year alone we've lifted 90,000 children out of poverty. Here's what we're delivering for you in the midst of a cost of living crisis, from free education to not paying a penny for your prescriptions, etc., etc. So I can go through all of the record, and I won't do that for this podcast, but we've got to... But then the honesty bit, which you ask about, and I think is very legitimate, is saying to people that we haven't achieved everything we've wanted to achieve. And where we've had failures, though, where we've not stepped up to the mark, we've been upfront about that, we've been open about that, and we endeavour to learn lessons from that. If you can point to any government that's been in power for 16 and a half years, as long as we have been, and that hasn't had setbacks, in the face of, by the way, extraordinary headwinds, and look, some of those are due to funding decisions and cuts that are made from Westminster. Some of them are wholly our mistakes. We will own them, hold our hands up, and make sure we deliver better.
But the SNP have been in power for a very, very long time, longer than the Tories in Westminster. Someone said to me the other day, did you realise that the iPhone hadn't been invented when the SNP came into power in Scotland? And then you look and say, educational results in Scotland are slipping down the international league tables when England is rising. The life expectancy for Scots has seen the sharpest fall in 40 years. You'd have to give yourself a school report of must do much, much better, wouldn't you?
No, I would look at 16 and a half years, and I would say that we have lifted 90,000 children out of poverty last year. That under the SNP, there's been not only record staffing in the NHS, but the best paid staff, more GPs per head than the rest of the UK. If I looked at GDP per income, adjusted for population, then we have grown since the SNP's been in power 10%. The UK has been about 6%. If I looked at productivity growth, we're about 1% a year, UK 0.5% a year. So I can point to where we've been able to deliver. But all of that has been characterised by a social contract that we've never shied away from. So that has meant in that social contract, if you're a top 5% earner in Scotland, you may well pay more in tax. Top earner like myself, you'll pay a little bit more in tax. But the social contract means that there are a number of universal benefits that are only available in Scotland, not paying a single penny for university tuition, some of the best universities in the world. Free childcare, prescription charges I've already mentioned, bus travel, free bus travel for under 22s and over 60s.
Lots of benefits, but hospitals and schools not succeeding.
That's not the case. If you look at our A&E performance has been better than A&E departments in England and Wales for the last 8 years.
Now, we're not going to challenge each other on this stuff, because that's for another day to do that, another sort of interview as well. Let me just bring the interview to a close by ask you the obvious thing, which is about independence itself, which is arguably problem 3 that you face at the moment, after the police investigation, after delivery, is that, yes, you're in pretty much the position you were 10 years or so ago when people voted. The country's pretty much divided down the middle about whether to be independent or not. But the idea of independence has dropped down people's list of priorities. It's just not what they want to talk about just now for many, many people, is it?
I think my job is to make sure that I ensure that independence is relevant to people's everyday lives and priorities, because in my view it very much is. So if we take the issue, so you've said independence, polls have shown that the actual issue of independence may well have dropped down. Well, what's the issue?
It went down to 7th in one poll, way behind other things.
What's the number one issue? The economy and cost of living. And independence is absolutely fundamental to both. When it comes to our economy, unleashing the full potential, well, we don't have the monetary, the fiscal levers, we don't have control over employment law, competition law, corporation tax, the whole suite of taxation that could help to boost our economy. It's absolutely linked to a cost of living crisis. We didn't bring forward a disastrous mini budget that torpedoed the economy. We didn't vote for Brexit. And I think that's the opportunity.
You remind me of some of the people in the 1980s who used to say, if we had real socialism, everything would be fine. We may control the whole of the health service, that's not going so well, but if you just gave us even more powers, we'd get things right.
The opposite. I would say, look what we've been able to do with the powers that we've got. Look how we've charted a different course. Now, you get Keir Starmer, who will say to people of the UK, oh, you cannot abolish tuition fees and invest in the NHS and do this and do that. And we're able to say in Scotland, actually, we're doing it. And by the way, we could do a hell of a lot more if we had the full powers of independence. So my argument during this general election very clearly will be to people, well, look, there is a better way. We don't have to remain in this Brexit-based economy that, without a shadow of a doubt, all of the independent analysis shows is a failing economy, a complete outlier in the rest of Northwest Europe. And we can chart a different course here in Scotland.
You can do what happened after Brexit. Introduce more trade barriers, more regulation, more barriers to goods going across borders, to people doing jobs across. It's a curious recipe.
We could have unfettered access to an EU single market that's 7 times the size of the UK market.
Right. That's the debate.
That is the opportunity and the prize of independence.
That's the prize that you want to have, and that's the debate we'll have if and when there's another independence referendum. Now, throughout this, you've said that you believe Keir Starmer is the next Prime Minister of Britain. I'm not sure he yet believes that. He, in a way, is in the position you were in Hogmanay 2 Hogmanays ago, not knowing what was going to happen. He's your political opponent, but I guess you have some empathy with the position he's in. What would you advise him about taking power?
I would advise him to be radical and be bold. He's 20 to 25% ahead in the polls. He's going to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I've not found a person in the country, be it a political analyst or a member of the public, that doesn't think Keir Starmer is going to win the next general election. And as I say, it gives Scotland an opportunity to say, if you want to get rid of Tory MPs in Scotland, the way you do that is you vote SNP, because we're second place in every single Tory seat north of the border. So vote for what you believe in. But what I say to Keir Starmer is, why are you not coming forward with a bold and radical plan? This is exactly the time to do it. You know you're going to be the next Prime Minister. And instead what we see is this triangulation of policies with the Conservatives. And the only really policy of difference that I've seen from Keir Starmer is the Green Prosperity Fund. And now even that has gone from being a plan to being a ambition, or confident ambition, beginning to roll back. And I should say this last point, that I'm very willing, I have to say, as First Minister of Scotland, to work with the UK Labour government in order, in the best interest of Scotland. Of course, I'll continue to push for the powers for a second referendum. That goes almost without saying. But in terms of unleashing Scotland's potential in renewables, I would also work with Labour to lift the two-child limit, for example, across the United Kingdom. So there's lots we can work together on. But to Sir Keir Starmer, show a bit of backbone, be bold, be radical, don't dump all your policies. And that is what the country is probably looking for.
And personal advice about what it's like, not as a party animal, not as a politician, but what it's like as a human being.
Draw your boundaries and make sure you spend time with your family. You know, I have been a government minister for 11 and a half years in various different ministerial offices. And I would say in 2016, towards the end of 2016, I had burnt both ends of the wick. And I mean, I'm not ashamed to say it, I went for counselling because I was near breakdown point and I didn't draw any boundaries in terms of my personal relationships. Effectively lost a marriage over it, actually. And, you know, there's other issues too, no doubt, but, you know, sacrifices of your family relationships. And it's not worth it. Your family is always going to be there for you. And so I made a very deliberate decision thereafter, and certainly as First Minister, to draw those boundaries. So my team knows on a Monday, between 7 and 8, we don't disturb him because he's giving his 4-year-old a bath and he's reading Never Ever Tickle a Tiger, which is a great book that I can recommend to put his little one to bed. So they know that. Those are the boundaries there. And on the weekend, I'll say to them, yep, I'll go through the box, I'll do what needs done. But you know what? I need Sunday, you know, at least until 3, 4 o'clock, where I'm just not doing anything but spending time with the kids. And that's it. So if I was to say anything to Sir Keir Starmer on a personal level, is from the very beginning, draw those boundaries and make sure you don't overly sacrifice time with your family.
And you said at the beginning of this interview that you worried about the impact on your 2 girls, one your teenage stepdaughter and your 4-year-old. He has said, Keir Starmer, that it is the biggest worry, so it's on this programme, was how to protect his children. Is there a way? Is it possible? Or do you just have to plead, frankly, with people like me, with journalists, with others, to say, give us the space?
It's hard. And it's not actually even the overt intrusion, because to some extent, you've got to accept that that's part of the job, and it's a hard part of the job. It's even just kind of going out to the park when I take my 4-year-old and I see the person come out with a mobile phone and begin to either take a picture or record, and you just feel a bit unsettled. And you know that your 4-year-old can see it, or your 14-year-old can see it, and it slightly unsettles you. And there's that difficulty and that balance between people understandably want to know who you are as a human being, and they can't understand me, or I suspect Keir Starmer, without knowing our family, because it's such a big part of who we are. But where do you draw the line? And I think that is the difficulty. And as I say, you can protect your 4-year-old a little bit more. 14-year-old who's on various different social media sites, even though we try to protect her from that, you know, that's a little bit harder, more difficult to protect.
Humza Yousaf, First Minister of Scotland. Thanks for joining me on Political Thinking.
Thank you.